Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody to our talk series for the Center for Music, Brain, and Society. My name is Asal Habibi. I direct the center, and we're just delighted to have a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Andrew Goldman, here today. I've known Andrew's work for a very long time, and I was very happy that he agreed to share his work with us today. He is a USC alumni, so it's good to have people who left come back and tell us about what they have achieved in the world. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to Andrew's work and then pass the stage to him. Andrew Goldman is a music theorist and cognitive scientist and is currently an assistant professor in music theory and cognitive science at Indiana University. He also directs the IU Music and Mind Lab. He received his PhD in 2015 at the Center for Music and Science at University of Cambridge with Ian Cross. He was an inaugural cohort of Presidential Scholar in Society and Neuroscience at Columbia University, where he did his postdoctoral work. His research considers how we can and cannot use scientific methods to learn about musical perception and cognition in theory, and he also designs and conducts behavioral and neuroscientific experiments on music perception and cognition. I'm going to stop there and let Andrew share his slide and work with us. And again, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it and looking forward to you hearing you.
Thank you, Asal. And it's really my pleasure. And it's a real pleasure to be back again with the USC community after so many years of being away. But nevertheless, it was a formative part of my intellectual scholarly development. And so I'm really happy to be back to share some ideas with you. So let me please share my screen. Bear with me. And here we go. Yeah, so as Asal mentioned, I do work on music cognition, and I'm not sure exactly who's in the audience today, but many of you, sympathize with some of the broad and difficult questions that arise when one tries to do scientific work on topics that are traditionally addressed in the humanities. And so, this talk is really inspired to try to address some of those interdisciplinary challenges and to try to systematize and organize some ideas that explain some of those difficulties and some of the contributions as well of applying scientific methods to humanistic work. So let me just start by sort of whetting your appetite a little bit with some studies that I encounter day to day in my research life, my neuroscience research life, on improvisation. So I mean, I work on improvisation among other topics, and I read others' neuroscientific studies, and I encounter studies like this, and I've done my own similar studies. But let me just sort of briefly explain a couple of neuroscience of improvisation studies. So here's a study by Cameron Arkin and colleagues from 2019. And in this study, they ask participants to sort of complete the sentence. So they give them a musical prompt that you can see down here. And participants are asked to improvise continuations, kind of like completing the sentence. They rated how creative those improvisations were. They asked participants how much improvisation experience they had, and they correlated a measure of brain structure called voxel-based morphometry. They correlated that with the creativity ratings and the improvisation experience, and try to explain something about creativity based on the structure of those brain areas, generally speaking. Here's another relatively recent study by Pinto et al. From 2016, in which they asked participants, while they're being scanned with fMRI, they asked participants to improvise under these different conditions. So sometimes people are asked to improvise using a set of pitches, like use these notes. Sometimes they were asked to respond to a prompt, and they were looking at differences in activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex under these different improvisatory conditions, in order to try to explain the different ways that this brain area may be involved depending on the improvisatory task. So neuroscience studies of improvisation in particular, encounter, as perhaps you can anticipate, a number of really difficult kinds of questions. How do you define improvisation for the purpose of a scientific study? How do you define a control condition that you try to compare improvisation against to try to isolate something about the improvisatoriness? Would we expect something to be in common across different improvisatory tasks? Like, is there something essentially, neural about different improvisatory tasks? what cognitive processes underlie improvisation in the first place? And if you don't know which cognitive processes are involved, could you ever use neural data to try to understand, and recover them, like what somebody is actually doing when they're improvising? I think these are very difficult and challenging questions. And just to throw out a few more questions that make this sort of work difficult, this kind of neuroscientific work is also operating in the context of a lot of other non-neuroscientific work on improvisation, including psychological work that has its own ways of investigating improvisation. So, Wilson and McDonald, for instance, are coming up with like a decision-making model of processes of different free improvisers, trying to describe how they make decisions. Martin Norgaard is asking people to improvise under different conditions and comparing how like cognitive load will increase the predictability of musicians' improvisations. Or from philosophy, Eric Lewis is interested in ontological questions in music and just what counts as novelty anyway from a philosophical point of view. In critical work, George Lewis is writing about aphrological and neurological perspectives on improvisation and the different cultural and historical contexts that describe those different musical traditions. Anyway, there's a whole handbook of all sorts of different scholarly approaches to improvisation, which I invite you to check out if you're interested in this topic, if you haven't already. My point being that there are a lot of really difficult questions when a neuroscientist tries to pick up a topic like this, a musical topic. How do we define the behavior? How does all of this other humanistic work sort of influence the way we're asking questions? And as someone who's done neuroscientific work on improvisation, and perhaps you faced similar or analogous questions in other sorts of research topics, there are challenges here. And my purpose in this talk is to try to systematize some of these ideas. I sort of just thrown out a lot of questions, but in this project, I've tried to identify like, okay, so why do we want to do neuroscience? Well, I tried to identify three different contributions here. Here are three things I think neuroscience serves to add to our understanding of these complicated musical phenomena. Mechanistic explanations, the ability to compare certain behaviors and cognitive processes, the ability to transfer knowledge across domains of scientific understanding. But I've also tried to systematize some of the difficulties of doing neuroscientific work. Defining behavior. How do we define something like improvisation, and how does that affect our scientific inquiry? Reverse inference, which is a bit more technical issue in interpreting neural data. And also issues with what I'm referring to as cognitive ontology. So is there some stable set of musical capacities that humans have, or rather are our musical capacities contextually variable? This is another kind of question that I'm going to raise. So the structure of the talk from here is that I'm going to explain the contributions, the challenges, and then I'm going to apply these ideas to my own neuroscientific work on improvisation, and then also some of my own neuroscientific work on another musical topic, which is musical syntax. Okay, so I'll talk about the three contributions, then the three challenges, and then the case studies. All right, so one common answer, I think, to why we might wish to use neuroscience for something like music is that it might provide some kind of mechanistic explanations, that neuroscience is able to answer how questions. So, how are people with absolute pitch able to identify pitch names? Well, Louis et al. Did a neuroscience study and used neuroscience to explain that this ability is, quote, subserved by heightened connectivity in white matter between auditory perception and association cortices. So they explain a musical capacity with reference to some kind of neurophysiology. Or, again, Pinho et al. Done studies on improvisation. They want to explain how people improvise, and part of their answer uses neuroscience as a form of explanation and says, well, people are able to improvise because they have greater functional connectivity between certain frontocortical regions. So appealing to neuroscience to explain how people do things. You may have used this term mechanism. You may encounter it in scientific research. And I think it's worth sort of unpicking just what a mechanism is. Sometimes the term is used in a sort of general way, but there is philosophy of science on what a mechanism is specifically. And here I reference Mackamer, Darden, and Craver, who define mechanisms as entities and activities organized such that they are productive of regular changes from start or setup to finish or termination conditions. So if we can identify the entities and the activities and explain how they're organized, now we have a mechanistic explanation. So what are the different brain areas? What are they doing? How does that give rise to the behavior? So for example, with auditory transduction, we might set up our starting conditions from tympanic membrane vibration to hair cell depolarization and identify the various entities and activities that connect the two, tympanic membranes, ossicles, basilar membranes, and so on, and identify what they do. If we can explain how that's organized, then we have a mechanistic explanation of auditory transduction. I think interestingly, mechanistic explanations can be incomplete, but still be explanatory. So, an explanation like this would leave out, say, the filtering properties of the pinnae, or, influences of top-down influences of like your knowledge of a native language. It can leave that out, but still be explanatory. If you have a missing kinocilium, you know why that disrupts auditory transduction even without addressing top-down processes. So you can have an incomplete, mechanism sketch in Makamura et al.'s terms, which is still explanatory, even if we haven't filled in all of the details or identify all of the influences. And then finally, I think a nice, feature of mechanisms is that to some extent they can be perspectival. So, you might have different definitions of improvisation. You might think of it in terms of like generative algorithms, like how do I create a nice list of notes to play versus, the social interaction aspects of improvisation. Each of those are both, good aspects, definitions of improvisation, but they could have their own mechanisms. And you could explain, both. So, the point being that a mechanistic explanation in neuroscience doesn't have to be absolutely complete and identify every possible influence. It can still be explanatory, and it can be pluralist. You can have different, definitions and still have mechanistic explanations. So that's one contribution I think that neuroscience gives us, even for complicated things like improvisation. A second one is comparison. So, neuroscience allows us to do certain forms of comparison that might not be possible otherwise. So one form of comparison would be showing similarity when things appear to be different, like behaviorally. So you might think, for instance, that language and music appear to be different in some ways. Well, neuroscience helps us compare them and show that, in fact, they share certain, neural correlates. So I'm thinking of, Stefan Kolsch's work. And in this study from 2002, where they're looking at music processing and language processing and note similar neural underpinnings. One of the things I like about this study is that they propose to shift their understanding of that brain activity not language and not music, but they say it's sequential auditory processing. So through comparison, they refine their understanding of what's going on in the first place. The right way to sort of describe and identify that function. So, neuroscience can show comparison. It can show similarity when things appear to be different on the behavioral surface, and it can also show difference, when things appear to be the same on the behavioral surface. So improvisation might appear like it's one thing, but through neuroscience, one might find that in fact there are different neural correlates in neurophysiology depending on certain other characteristics. So for instance, Rosen et al. Did this nice study where they used transcranial direct current stimulation, and they showed that this particular stimulation affected novices and experts differently. So a less active DLPFC for experts improved their improvisations, and a more active one, or a less active one for novices made it worse for them. So it helped experts and it hindered novices. Anyway, they provide an explanation for this, but my point is that on the behavioral surface, you see two people improvising, you may think that it's one process, but in fact, experts and novices benefit from different sorts of underlying neurophysiological correlates. So neuroscience can show difference when things appear to be the same behaviorally. Okay, so comparison is another thing that neuroscience offers us when we study music. And then a third one I think of as transferring knowledge. So neuroscience allows us to transfer knowledge across theoretical frameworks. And what I mean by that is that if you have like a physical handle on something mental, and that may mean understanding the neuroanatomy or neurophysiology of some behavior, if you have a physical handle on it, well, now you're empowered to make certain kinds of explanations and to make certain kinds of interventions. So, for instance, you may use neuroscientific evidence as evidence for design in an evolutionary argument. as Savage et al. Do. They provide, among other forms of evidence, neuroscientific evidence for particular evolutionary theory of music. So, with some anatomical, physiological understanding of the nervous system of the brain, they're able to make an evolutionary argument. And I think of that as a form of transferring knowledge. You take something about the brain, you can understand something else scientific. Or physical and medical transfer. So again, if you have a physical handle on the brain, well, again, take this Rosen et al. Study where they stimulated the brains of improvisers. Now you have a physical ability to manipulate this behavior. In their case, they have creativity as a function of electricity, right? They're using electrical stimulation to change something about behavior. Well, that's connecting neuroscientific understanding with some kind of physical intervention. You might also, I also point to medical interventions. So, for example, Michael Tout has written about rhythmic auditory stimulation as a way of, a physical understanding of how music affects the brain can be used for medical intervention. So, this is a third category of thing that I think neuroscience contributes. So to me, when I answer the question for myself, why would a music scholar be interested in neuroscience? Well, I would point to these three things. It gives us mechanistic explanations, which have some nice characteristics about them. It allows us to make certain kinds of comparisons that might not be possible otherwise. And it has this powerful way of transferring knowledge to other domains of inquiry. So that's my answer to that question. Maybe there are other things too. All right. Okay. So I also try to answer the question to myself, well, what are the major challenges to using neuroscience in the study of music? And I have in mind in particular improvisation. But what are some of the challenges? How can we identify and organize those ideas? So I'll talk a little bit about that now. So a first challenge that I identify is defining behavior. So, what is improvisation and what is someone doing when you ask them to improvise? To explain a behavior, a neuroscientist must at some point define a behavior. It's not so easy to define behavior. It's not just merely continuous movement. There are discrete behaviors that we can try to identify. We can try to analyze continuous movement into behaviors using some kind of theory in an analogous way that music theorists analyze music into formal structures and pieces, bits, formal ideas like harmonies and cadences and so on. So we have to analyze movement into behavior somehow, and there can be different ways to do that. So there can often be multiple answers, especially for something like improvisation. What is the behavior? Are you going to identify that as a generative algorithmic process, where you're trying to explain how people come up with the right notes? Well, then you might, if you do that, you may seek mechanistic explanations of how do people recall ideas from long-term memory. So how you define the behavior will affect what kind of mechanistic explanation you come up with. Alternatively, if you conceive of the behavior more in terms of social interaction, and that to improvise is to sort of fluently read somebody else's cues, well, then it's going to be really important to understand how people recognize those cues and understand, perspective taking or reading emotional cues from somebody else, and your mechanistic explanations may aim to explain those things instead. So here's some examples of that. So the upshot is that different theorizations of the same behavior may motivate the search for different mechanistic explanations. You might be trying to explain different things about this, depending on how you define it. So is this a problem for neuroscience? Well, from one perspective, maybe not, right? Maybe you just accept that, well, I'm explaining it how I define it. But I just want to point out a couple of possible pitfalls here. One is to not mistake that kind of an explanation for naturalizing the behavior. So in other words, the mechanistic explanation that you come up with is not necessarily evidence that you have like the correct parsing of the behavior, that this is what it is. You have an explanation for as you've defined it. But I think we shouldn't mistake that for coming up with like a true, real category of behavior. That we don't want to just use neuroscience to reinforce what we're saying improvisation is, when it could be other things as well. And then another more practical issue is that we want to make sure we have a sort of clear and explicit enough understanding of behavior to interpret neural correlates. So if you have like an underdefined, behavior, and I say, well, improvise in my study, well, someone might know what I mean when I ask them to improvise. But if I don't have a clear idea of what cognitive processes are involved in that behavior, I'll have a difficult time interpreting the neural correlates. How should I map those? To what cognitive process should I map them? So I think that's a more practical problem, is having like a thorough and specific enough definition of behavior to interpret neural data. And if you're not in that situation where you have a very clear definition of behavior, then I think that you become vulnerable to a second challenge, which is reverse inference. Um, I think this is a problem that many neuroscientists are very aware of. But just to go through it quickly, if you know that rain gets the sidewalk wet and you see a wet sidewalk, you should not reverse infer that it rained because maybe something else made the sidewalk wet. And by analogy, if you know that some cognitive process causes some brain activity, and then you later observe that same brain activity, you shouldn't reverse infer that daydreaming happened here because maybe something else happened here. So the point of this challenge is just that in situations where you don't have a super clear definition of behavior, then you shouldn't expect to be able to recover what that cognitive process was by looking at the brain data alone, because it's not as simple as a one-to-one mapping. And so you may not be able to recover what the cognitive process was by looking at the brain data. I think that's a challenge. Okay, so then finally, a third challenge, and I put these in a category of what I'm calling cognitive ontological challenges. And basically what I mean by this is that, if we don't have, well, perhaps we have a set of cognitive processes that our minds are capable of doing, perhaps through evolutionary, forces. Like these are the things our minds can do. That's one perspective on the mind. But another is that the things that we are capable of doing are contextually variable. So like in music, it may be that I have some set of musical processes that I'm capable of doing, or rather it may be that I apply certain capacities to accomplish musical functions. And if the musical functions are changing, the way I use my mind and brain may also change. So that's the kind of challenge I'm pointing to. And let me try to make that a bit more specific and concrete. So for instance, is music syntax one of the things that our minds can process, or is it rather language syntax, or is it syntax in general, or is it sequential auditory processing? Like, what's the right level of generality to characterize the mental functions that we have? Remember that the Kohlschedal study, they thought to say, well, let's test whether music engages similar neural networks as language. Oh, it does. So we should recategorize this as sequential auditory information. It leads me to wonder what other possible comparisons that we haven't thought of yet might further refine, the right level of generality to describe what the actual function is in the brain. Like how do we characterize and describe that function? What thing is in our cognitive ontology? Is it language? Is it music? Is it sequential auditory processing? So I take this to be, an interesting philosophical question of like, what are the functions that the mind can do in the first place? Can we enumerate them? Or are they contextually variable? So, contextualists will argue that the same neural structure can subserve one psychological function in one circumstance, but a different function in another circumstance. One such theory that I think makes this really clear to me, like what the problem is here. I like this quote by Hutto et al., and they say, why assume that neural structures have any stable functions at all? Why not allow that the brain is radically MacGyverish and protean, using and reusing its internal resources in inventive, on-the-fly improvisations? I love that they use the word improvisation there. On-the-fly improvisations to suit circumstance and context. So, in this view, contextual demands, what our musical practice is that we're trying to accomplish, enlist brain areas capable of accomplishing that behavior. But there's no essential mapping between like brain areas and cognitive functions in a similar way that there's not a essential mapping between anatomical structures like hands and their functions. There are a lot of possible functions. There are a lot of things that a hand could be good for, And by analogy, there may be a lot of things that a particular brain area is good for if only facing the right, challenge in the environment, the right thing that it needs to accomplish. So maybe we apply some kind of cognitive capacities to accomplish musical tasks rather than trying to discover what the essential function of a neural structure is. So there may not be essential functions. Like is this contextualist idea? I'm also thinking here of work by Cecilia Hayes. Even cognitive capacities supposedly as fundamental as language have been theorized to be sort of combinations of other capacities that are applied to accomplish them. That what Hayes calls a starter kit of capacities, and she thinks of the constructed abilities as cognitive gadgets, that we construct out of these sort of more basic capacities. So maybe music is like that too. If that's the case, then we have just as many questions about describing what the practices themselves are as we do in trying to look at the neuroscience. It's really important, especially there, that we know what challenge someone is trying to accomplish with their brains. So, in trying to organize, like, what are the challenges? Well, these are the things that I identify as the challenges for me. Okay. So then I'll move to case studies. So I'm going to apply in the next 15 minutes or so for the remainder of the talk. I'm going to think through these two topics, improvisation and syntax, using these 6 ideas and show you how they've applied in my own work and in some related work in the field. So like I say, I've done a couple of neuroscientific studies on improvisation. I'll share them with you. In many studies in improvisation, thinking about how they define behavior, and I'm sorry, I don't know how well you can see the slide on your screen for the text, but these are many neuroscience studies of improvisation, and I pulled out the quote that is like how they defined improvisation, and many of them draw from the psychology of creativity literature and use ideas of like novelty and usefulness as a way of defining what improvisation is. So, for instance, creativity requires both novelty and effectiveness. Improvisation can be defined as spontaneous generation of novel auditory motor sequences, extemporization of novel and contextually meaningful. So it's novel and it's meaningful, or novel and useful, or novel and appropriate. And many of these neuroscience studies are trying to find neural correlates of these kinds of novelty processes, basically. So just thinking through like what the contributions and challenges are here for improvisation studies. Do they provide mechanistic explanations? I think to some extent. I mean, many of these studies have found certain brain areas to be important for improvisatory behaviors, and there are accounts of how they function, what their importance is in improvisation. There have been forms of comparison, between types of improvisation that have different neural correlates. So I think to some extent it accomplishes that goal. I think there's some transferring knowledge. I think about Rosen stimulating the brain and changing improvisatory processes. I think that's transferring knowledge. I think that there are also challenges here, though. And to me, some of the main challenges revolve around defining improvisation. I think there's considerably more variety than the kinds of things that are investigated in neuroscience studies that we could investigate, and other sorts of questions that might lead to more specific, like theoretically motivated questions about the behavior, better definitions of the behavior, and better conceptions of what cognitive processes are actually going on there. I think reverse inference is a problem in some of these studies. I mean, some of the brain areas involved are also involved in many other cognitive processes. So, I mean, we can argue about the extent to which that is a problem for these studies, but in some more than others, I would say. And then cognitive ontology. Is there something essentially improvisatory, or do improvisation behaviors change depending on like what musical task you're trying to do? My own work on improvisation has tried to address these challenges, more specifically the defining behavior issue and the cognitive ontology issue. So in my theoretical work, I've taken a lot of time to think about, like, can we identify more specific processes that we may wish to explain? And I've also thought a little bit about, ontological issues with improvisation. Is it one thing or many things? So let me share with you some of my theoretical and experimental work on this. One of my earlier projects, which came out of my PhD, dissertation was trying to ask other questions about improvisation in music besides like novelty. And I observed that improvisers, they learn music differently, and I think that they conceptualize musical structures differently. Like improvisers practice things like imitation and transcription and transposition, which may lead to differences in motor cognition. So the way that they're thinking about musical structures, they train differently, they practice differently, maybe they're thinking differently. And this is not exactly a question about generating novel motor sequences. It's a question about how skilled improvisers are thinking about musical structures. Specifically, I think that, from this theory, I think, well, maybe improvisers have a special way of perceiving like the movements behind musical structures. Maybe they like generalize. It's not just a specific movement. They know how to associate certain movements with certain sounds, and that they have a particular advantage in that regard. I think that leads to a more specific neuroscientific hypothesis related to motor cognition. I'll show you a study that I did based on that. Actually, let me just show it to you now. There's another specific hypothesis that comes out of this, but I'll get to that in a minute. So along these lines, I did a neuroscience study with improvising dancers and thought, well, in particular, we were looking at contact improvisers. I don't know if you've encountered contact improvisation before. Let me just. So, contact improvisation is a form of dance where people dance in pairs or small groups, and they're continuously sensing each other's motion and moving off of each other. And, this practice, and this kind of also is similar to the kinds of things I was thinking about in my theoretical work. What does it require to do this? Like, you have to have a very keen sense of what somebody else is doing. You need to be able to perceive their movements accurately and predict their movements. Is this improvisatory? Yes. Does it have elements of novelty? Yes. But a lot of what's going on here is, I think, related to motor imagery and motor expectations. And so I think that's a more specific kind of a question that we could bring to neuroscience. And so we did an EEG study where we had contact improvisers, people who knew how to do this kind of dance. We had them watch an experimenter perform different movements, and we measured their mu rhythm desynchronization with EEG, which is a measure of motor cortex activity, basically. So we were measuring, how much are they imagining movements when they watch somebody else, right? And we found that contact improvisers, like the amount of experience with contact improvisation predicts how much mu rhythm desynchronization you have. So more experience, improvising, more sort of sympathetic motor imagery, if you like. So, the theory here is doing a lot of work. Like, we're trying to ask a more specific question about the behavior to have, our neuroscientific data speak to a more specific question about a cognitive process. Another study that I did had to do with musicians and, thinking about like, how does an improviser conceptualize musical structures differently? How can we be more specific about what kinds of cognitive processes are involved? Well, I started by noticing that improvisers, they read a different kind of notation, at least in jazz. They use a kind of notation that specifies what to play, but in an abstract way, so that there could be multiple different ways to realize this score. Play an F minor 7 chord. Okay, well, there could be different ways to do that. Whereas people who don't improvise as much in Western music use notation that fully specifies which notes to play exactly. Right? So the improvisers are sort of required to have like a category of different possible things that could accomplish the same goal, right? Different ways of playing an F minor 7 chord. So I thought, well, this is probably important for improvisation, is categorizing musical structures that have a similar function. Does that have to do with novelty? We could argue whether that counts as novelty, but I'm trying to identify a specific kind of cognitive process before going to neuroscience to try to find any evidence, right? So categorization. So maybe improvisers categorize differently, and maybe they categorize what I'm thinking of as like substitutable harmonies as similar. In other words, two different ways of doing the same musical thing sound the same for improvisers, but might sound different for non-improvisers. We did an oddball study where we played people lots of these little short chord progressions where, sometimes there would be a different one that was in the same category, and sometimes there would be a different one that was in a different category. And I'm going through this quite quickly. I'd be happy to talk more about the specific study. But the upshot was that, yes, like the non-substitutable structures sounded more different to people than than the substitutable ones. And we use this as evidence to say that, improvisers, yes, indeed, are thinking categorically. The neuroscience helps us show that. We show this with an ERP study and event-related potential study that, yeah, there's a stronger response, for non-substitutable structures. But the theory is doing a lot of work there. Identifying the specific question is really important. Trying to define a specific cognitive process that's involved here, I think helps us use and interpret neuroscientific data. Okay, I'd be happy to talk more about this study, but I've just used it as an example of defining a specific question. And then finally, as it pertains to these ontological questions, some of my other theoretical work has been concerned with like defining different types of improvising. Is it all one sort of thing, or is it different things? Sorry, I'm trying to see my slides here. There's Zoom stuff in the way. I was provoked by observing a certain kind of improvisatory practice called live coding, in which performers write computer code in real time and to produce music. Well, this is a form of improvisation, but so is playing the piano. And I wondered, do these share cognitive processes? Like they're both improvisatory in some definition, but they seem to require very different kinds of cognitive resources. With electroacoustic instruments, your physical action is coupled to the auditory feedback. But with live coding, you're typing. And so there can be some space between how you move and what sound you hear. Same thing temporally. Like if you're playing an instrument, you press a key, you get feedback right away. But for live coding, that's not necessarily true. With electroacoustic instruments, you're continuously changing what you do. But with live coding, you literally like pause and execute the code. And so there are sort of punctuated points of decision making. Anyway, this leads me to think that there are different categories of improvising that may not share all cognitive processes. It may just be that, these different musical practices require that we apply different cognitive resources depending on what the practice requires. Are they both improvisatory? Well, yes, on some definition, but they seem to require different cognitive resources. So, what improvisation is affects how we need to use our minds to do it. And there may not be anything essential to the neural processes of improvisation. Okay, so that's, been sort of my response to some of these problems in my own work. And then I just want to give you one other sort of category of examples from my neuroscientific work on syntax, which I think makes some similar points, but I'll just share this with you as well. So many studies of musical syntax are concerned with how we are able to detect improbable harmonic continuations. So you'll hear stimuli that sound like this. And then that last chord is supposed to be surprising. And many neuroscience studies have looked for EEG correlates of this kind of surprise. And they have found this particular ERP component that is thought to index, your surprisal based on some kind of long-term memory of harmonic probabilities. So you're sensitive to improbable events. This ERP component has been observed in many studies. It's been linked to similar effects in language. People have used it to make arguments about which chord progressions are most surprising, or who's more surprised, improvisers and classical musicians, and why. So this is another area of research that I've encountered and responded to in some ways. So again, just trying to think about it through these 6 ideas. Interestingly, is this a mechanistic explanation? Well, if you take it in conjunction with other studies of fMRI studies and MEG studies that do identify neural structures, yeah, I think you can form mechanistic explanations with that additional knowledge. Although I'll just say that. Comparison, yes, between music and language. These studies have been compared against similar effects in linguistic surprise paradigms and syntax. Transferring knowledge, yeah, this kind of overlap between music and language in this regard has been used for evolutionary theories, for instance. Okay, great. I still think that there are challenges here. What cognitive processes are actually underlying a musical capacity like this of detecting, harmonic improbabilities? I think that there are further questions that we can ask about that. my experimental work has been, focused on trying to be a bit more specific about what might be going on in these kinds of paradigms. Reverse inference, I think, is less of an issue here. There's not an appeal to like, well, other studies have found this brain area to be active, so we think it's doing the same thing. It's not that kind of reasoning, so it avoids that sort of logical problem. The cognitive ontological issues here, I think, actually even maybe contribute something, like I said with the Kolsch study, that, oh, it's not music, it's not language, it's actually sequential auditory processing or something more general. Although I do point out, and this is a topic for another talk perhaps, that whether this is applicable to all music perception in different musical traditions, I think is a question. It's focused on harmony in many cases, right? But if your musical tradition isn't relying so much on harmonic transition probabilities like Western art music does, then this might not be the right question to ask. Okay, but anyway, my own experimental work on this has been concerned with the first point about trying to be more specific about the cognitive processes underlying this response. One thing that we noticed, and I'm going to go through this briefly because we're almost out of time here, but instead of, in our study, instead of doing these sort of really stark, surprising chords like this, we looked at a large corpus of different chord progressions, and we quantified how surprising each individual chord was, as opposed to having like a categorical distinction between surprising and not surprising. We said, well, every chord is a little bit surprising, and we quantified that with a computational model, idiom in particular, if you know it. And we were trying to see, well, is the ERAN, is this indexing general, just like surprisal of any chord, or is it more specifically related to these really stark categorical surprises? So, we did a single trial analysis with this study and looked at ERPs in response to every chord and tried to correlate, the computational model of surprisal with the ERANs, and did not find a correlation there. So, like, we found a correlation with another computational model of that was modeling the acoustic similarity, but not for the harmonic prediction element of it. So in other words, you appear to get ERANs in certain situations of the stark categorical surprise, but not in the general situation that every chord is surprising. The upshot of this that I take away from this is that, there are further questions about what exactly that underlying cognitive process is that needs some definition in order to interpret just what the ERAN is indexing. Is it general surprisal, or is it specific to categorical surprises? Defining cognitive processes is important, right? That's the upshot. Okay, and then finally, a hot off the press study. This is a very similar kind of a paradigm, but here sometimes participants hear a short chord progression. Oops, sounds like this. And sometimes they hear a long one. And we tell people whether it's going to be short or long. In my opinion, I feel like the long one, it sounds less surprising than the short one. So we thought, well, what happens if we tell people, the length of the progression? It changes how you listen to it in some way, and I could go into more detail about how, if you'd like to, in the Q&A. But the point being that we thought that if we tell people something about like the structure of the chord progression, maybe it changes how they're listening to the surprising event. And indeed, we found in our study that like if you tell people the length of the chord progression, they have a stronger response to the longer progression than the shorter one. And so we take this as evidence as a kind of top-down influence, like it depends on if you know the structure of the music. Anyway, I offer it just as another example that there are further questions to ask about just which cognitive processes this ERP component is supposed to be indexing. And insights into like better defining those processes are coming from music, actually, from music studies and music theory. Okay, just by way of summary, I think it's important to try to be explicit about why we want to use neuroscience in music studies. And I think there are some contributions, but I also think there are some significant challenges, as I've identified, that raise some really interesting philosophical issues about the musical mind. I've applied these ideas to improvisation and syntax. I think they're possibly more broadly applicable to other musical topics, but not without further work to adapt them. And I think this is just another way of sort of addressing science humanities issues. Like a lot of the insights into defining behavior come from music theory. They come from the humanities. I think it's important to keep that in mind. So I know there's a lot of stuff in this talk, and it's kind of fast-paced and dense. So I do appreciate your attention, and I hope that some of these ideas were interesting to you and stuck with you. And I look forward to any conversation or questions that you have. So thanks for your attention. Thanks. Should I field my own questions or?
Yeah, go ahead, please, everybody. Maybe just Andrew pick people who have their hands up, and I'll go last.
Okay, thanks, Asal. Yeah, Sean, thanks.
Hi, Dr. Goldman. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your work. So, regarding the study you talked about with chord progressions, do you also consider how the environment that these people grew up in or the focus of their work affects their predictions on certain chords? Like, would listening to certain genres of music on a regular basis or during childhood evoke different predictions of what chord would come next? That makes sense?
Yeah, good question, right? And that's if the idea is that our ERP response to this is due to some kind of learning, then you need to check, was it really learning? Like, did it matter what you listened to? So yes, there have been these kinds of comparisons between musically trained people and musically untrained people who have different levels of exposure. There have been I think most directly to your question, there was a recent study by Bouvan and Hughes who looked at like genre specific predictions. So if you cue somebody to sort of think in a rock way, they'll have different harmonic predictions than if you think in a classical way. So it's a cool study that, yeah. So yes, I mean, I think that learning matters, and other studies have shown that too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Other question, comments?
I can't raise my hand, but I'm here.
Go ahead, Adam.
I've lost my hand, my reaction. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldman. I'm going to make one comment and ask a question. One is that once I work on 15th century improvisation, among other things, and once we did a procedure that was improvisational, but somebody said the rules are so solid that it's too easy. It's not improvisation. So that question of how much is something automatically the grammar is there. But my bigger question for you is, you talked about the oral aspects of this, and one of my questions is: have you worked with different elements to which visual part takes place in improvisation? Because for me, I improvise both visually, remembering seeing something visually, and also then thinking about chords, not things, images that I know. Is there something working on dealing with that aspect of it?
I remember being in your office, Dr. Gilbert, in 2011 and having a similar conversation with you. I think you raised a similar question right before I started my PhD. And and at the time, I think I'm trying to remember how that ended up becoming part of the work. The short answer is no. I don't really know of how to approach that. Like, I don't. I'm not saying it's not involved. I don't know how to. Like, are you talking about visual imagery? Yeah,
Well, for instance, I learned how to improvise by looking at a melody and learning all the possible ways you could get from one note to another,
Hmm.
but I saw it visually.
Yeah,
Then, when I learned how to do it without looking at the music, I actually imagined I was doing the same thing walking up the stairs blind because I can't see anything when I close my eyes. But
yeah.
then there's also when you start from scratch, you just hear a melody and you start improvising. I don't have a, so I sense that I'm very strongly visual. I almost entirely look at and hear music visually. So I'm wondering that kind of aspect of how much does seeing things affect what you're doing?
And there may be individual variation in how people
Yes.
conceptualize musical structures, right? So, I in that case, I would be inclined to ask, who are the ones who do this visually and why? How does that affect the structure of their output? The visual improvisers play different things, than auditory ones. Um, I know that there are some studies of like mental rotation of melodies, right? It's not about improvisation, but I think it's Andrea Halpern and Satori, I think, if I'm recalling correctly, did a study where like they asked people to rotate melodies somehow. Um, uh, anyway, that's a kind of visual concept there. But yeah, I don't know.
I'll follow it up with two things. You know, I'm into rotating melodies, but you know that
Yeah, well, we know
viscerally.
that. Yes.
The other thing is that one of the earliest forms of documented improvisation in the 15th century was called citing. You looked at something and you visualize the other notes around it. So anyway, great, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll talk to Sal about that next too. Let's stick people in front of a computer thing.
Well, I can ask a question. I think this was a really great and comprehensive talk. Thank you so much. It made me think about something that I've been thinking also about this more and more of this instance of reverse inference that I see in the literature coming up and now with not only with functional MRI and ERP, but like microstructure, white matter organization, and relating that to certain musical skills or musical abilities or music performances. And I really like your framework of how to look at these as general constructs and kind of looking at it from a cognitive perspective. But I mean, you have worked in this field for like 15 years now or so. I guess what I want to ask is how do we protect ourselves in this so we don't become that melody relates to this and rhythm relates to this and this white matter connection predicts this ability and kind of continue looking at a global perspective and not just kind of put music in that certain category that has specific brain function.
Yeah. I want to have this conversation, I don't know. And I had some ideas about this. I think it's worth keeping in mind some like different goals and epistemologies of science. If our goal is to correctly represent, like what are the musical capacities, and try to discover like something about the true structure of music cognition, that's one kind of a goal. Another goal is to be satisfied with associations and to be satisfied with this predicts that, and not have to worry about whether we're truly reflecting the reality. Um, so I'm peripherally aware in the philosophy of science that there are these different attitudes, and I think they're relevant. I'm thinking about like Ian Hacking's distinction, his book Representing and Intervening, and he has theories of realism. I think that's what's at stake here, right? Like, is this really the musical capacity that we have, or is it just somehow like a combination of other things that we're not really able to detect what it is? There are views that we don't really have to worry about it, and we can be satisfied with a more intervening kind of science.
Yeah.
Is that enough for us? And to be honest, I'm sort of feeling like I'm satisfied with science's ability to do that, and that if I want to feel like I understand what music is, then I go to the humanist kind of perspective. But that's one view. But I don't know, and I would love to hear what others think about this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I'd be satisfied with science in that way as well. I think one thing that is concerning to me, seeing these causal inferences being translated into therapeutic interventions, and then we run these clinical trials with therapies of music-based interventions, and we don't always get the same results or even kind of close to what we expect. And that I feel like the theory behind it was just blown beyond what the cognitive processes is. But yeah, we can have a longer conversation. I see John has a question. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Whoops, I think you're muted, maybe, John. Whoops, are you muted, John?
John,
Whoops.
you're muted still. Let's see if I can ask you to unmute.
I was muted by somebody else. There we go. Sorry.
No problem.
We look at Music Men's Minds as far as the effect on seniors, not just for wellness, enjoyment, and whatever, but as reduction of tension and stress and depression, and a positive socialization aspect, which has an enormous healthful positive feel to that. Has that been a part of your study?
So I haven't personally done those kinds of studies, but that's one of the great examples I have of that I think of when I think of like transferring knowledge. Like this is something that neuroscience helps us to do. It's therapeutic interventions. Yeah, so I haven't personally done that research, but I'm interested in it because it's a good example.
Good. We somehow we should be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks.
We will share the slide that Andrews had. Kai, you have a question.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for sharing. That was so lovely. Just a follow-up question to John's mention of therapeutic techniques, and I'm curious how your research on improvisational methods, which is so interesting, how you see that transferring into music therapy, and that realm. I would just be curious to see what your thoughts on that.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm peripherally aware that improvisation is used in therapeutic contexts. My own work doesn't address that. One question that, one thing that one way that my work might intersect with that work would be to say, oh, well, here are some specific differences in improvisers' cognition. They have more motor imagery and they categorize differently. Do those things help people in some way? Because if they do, then maybe we could, teach in a certain way. That would be the kind of logic that I would use to try to bridge those two things. But as of yet, I haven't done that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions? I want to mention that, especially for the students who are joining us, Dr. Goldman not only is a great scientist, but a great musician. And I think it's just really good to know that combination of these two skills can complement each other and have these really deep dives into both meanings of what we do and how we can interpret it both from a humanistic and scientific perspective.
Thanks, Asal. Yeah, and if you're interested, you could check out my musical, Science, the Musical. It's on my website.
May I annoy Andrew and tell you guys all a story?
Go ahead, and we'll finish with that.
My first musicology class at USC, Andrew walked in and I taught them about a piece of music from 2,000 years ago, the Song of Seculos. I think maybe Sean knows that piece. And then the next class, he came back with a quod libet for two flutes in bossa nova style, A Taste of Honey, and the Song of Seculos together. And I think that reflects the kind of creativity that Andrew talks about and works on. And that's still iconic moment from my career.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, no, yes, good stuff.
It's wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Goldman, for joining us and for sharing your work. Thank you, everybody, for being here and in continued interest in the center's talk series. We'll send more information and we'll have the recording of this talk on the center's website if you would like to rewatch it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So.